All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the U.S. Center. Really excited to have you here for this event, Advancing Resilience and Peace Building in a Changing Climate. And again, welcome to the U.S. Center. We have a full schedule here the first 2 weeks, so make sure you scan the QR code as the way out to get all the schedule. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce to the stage the Senior Advisor and Managing Director for Cross-Cutting Issues in the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, Kate Guy.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for getting up early and braving the lines to make it into this COP venue and coming here to spend the morning here with us at the U.S. Center. Speaking of the U.S. Center, let me give a massive shout out at the outset to our U.S. Center team for putting on not just this event, but all of the events over these 2 weeks. So round of applause for them to start things off. As was said, my name is Kate Guy. I manage all cross-cutting climate issues for the SPEC team, the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry's team. That means I get to do and work with an incredible team on all of the fun intersection nexus issues of climate change. So that includes climate in the oceans, climate and shipping, climate and science, climate and gender. It is a massive portfolio that grows with each passing day as the impacts of the climate crisis and the solutions to the climate crisis become more and more whole of society and whole of sector. But the one that is the nexus issue that's probably closest to my heart, that represents the background that I have and the work that I've done throughout my career, is this nexus between the climate crisis and security. That includes national security, so how we think about security in the U.S. context, in American interests, in our own border security, or security within our own borders and to protect Americans. But it also includes international security and international peace, and how the impacts of the climate crisis are increasingly becoming threats to the peace and stability of the world that we know. So this panel today is a reflection of that topic and also a reflection of the work that is happening on that topic, both in the U.S. government and around the world. As we know, this COP this year, the UAE in their COP presidency has brought this subject for the first time to a high level here to COP, with today being Relief, Recovery, and Peace Day. So we are very excited to kick that off here with the discussion about how we can better think about the linkage between climate and peace building here on the U.S. Center stage. So let me start by introducing our keynote speech for the morning, a woman who, if you know anything about climate and security, probably needs no introduction, but I will introduce her anyway. And she is the Honorable Sherry Goodman. And Sherry wears many hats, so I'll name a few of them. She's a senior fellow at the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and at the Polar Institute. She is the Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, a council that I was very privileged to be a part of and previously in my past career. She coined the term that so many of us hear frequently, threat multiplier. She coined that term when she was serving as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, way back before any of us were thinking about these nexus of issues. And she's also currently, I get to work with her at the State Department because she's Vice Chair of the Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board. So with all of that and more, let me welcome Sherry Goodman to the stage.
Well, thank you very much, Kate, and thank you all. It's a deep privilege and honor to be here with you all today. And let me also thank the U.S. Center, the U.S. government team, for all the work that you're doing. Let me give a special shout out to my colleague, Kate Guy, who has just been a marvel of leadership across so many dimensions of climate and climate nexus, climate security, in so many ways, and has really advanced climate action on so many important fronts. I feel very fortunate that this panel is occurring today because I think it's just at the heart of what this COP is all about, which is the nexus between climate, resilience, and peace building. And I have had the opportunity over my years to be part of the evolution of this field When I served as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security in the 1990s, I sent the first Department of Defense delegates to the COP in 1997. And this kind of subject could never have been a part of the discussion at that time. So we've really come a long way. We've come a long way also because we recognize now that climate change does act as a threat multiplier and increases risks to many communities and vulnerable populations around the world. And that's why it's increasingly important that what this is all about is the nexus and the integration of climate and resilience and peace building. And as a person who comes out of the security sector, climate security, I think, is increasingly defined more broadly and appropriately broadly. It's definitely not only about defense. It's really a lot about how we improve civilian populations' viability, how we ensure resilience. And I think the work that is being done now, as I've learned through the work doing at the State Department, is there's an increasing integration between our work on stabilization and resilience and recovery, as is said in the COP Declaration on Climate, Peace, and Recovery. And that becomes increasingly important because to have meaningful action in this space, we need to work across a whole of society and a whole of government approach. And I've been able to watch as that has increasingly become true in the U.S. government, and I know that on our partners around the world, that is also true. These are not efforts that can be done by one agency or even within an agency within one office. It takes the climate leaders working with the conflict and stabilization leaders, as we will hear from Ann Witkowski, the Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Stabilization, who is really leading the work in the State Department to integrate climate-sensitive peace-building efforts through her work on stabilization. And that is incredibly important. And so we are at this unique juncture, I think, where we can turn a corner in integrating efforts. We can move beyond our silos, and therefore we can develop some new important tools, because a lot of the action is going to occur at local levels. And we're here in this big conference, and there's a lot of enthusiasm and ambition, and then we will go back, and the work has to be done in communities. And so that's very important, that we are developing tailored climate-sensitive strategies for resilience that enable peace building in conflict-affected areas. And that's kind of the front line here. And to make that happen, we need some new tools that are being developed now through Ann Witkowski's office of CSO, and with others that we will hear from today in the Department of Navy, as well as from the international development organizations and potentially our international partners as well. And those go to early warning systems, because it's the food and water insecurity, the climate magnified drought, extreme weather events, and floods that are putting more populations at risk around the world. And as we have better early warning tools, as we have better data analytics, we are then better able to develop tailored climate resilience and peace-building strategies. So this, to me, is about the kind of merger of the peace-building and stabilization communities with the climate and security communities in a way that produces better results for people who are deeply affected. And that's why I'm very excited about this activity here, this effort here at the U.S. Center, but it is really grounded in working deeply and closely with our allies and partners, because that is how we make positive change for all. And so I want to thank you for joining me here today. It's a privilege for me to be able to say I think we're moving from what I've called the threat multiplier in climate to the opportunity multiplier. And this effort in climate-sensitive peace building. It's definitely an opportunity multiplier, and I'm very excited to be a part of this with all of you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sherry, not only for those remarks, but for all you've done to put this issue on the map, but not to stop there, to keep challenging us to build out U.S. and international policy at this nexus for the sake of ourselves and future generations of security. So thank you. All right, at this point, I will introduce our panel of distinguished guests who will discuss these issues now. The first has already been introduced, but let me add my own flavor to the U.S. Department of State Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, Ann Witowski. Coming out, Ann. Ann is such a leader, both within our own department and our government, for thinking about how these issues, as Sherry said, can be better brought to our policy environment. The next person we have here on the panel is the Associate Vice President for the International Institute of Sustainable Development. She also serves as the Secretariat for the NAP Global Network. Those are National Adaptation Plans, Global Network, Miss Ann Hamel. I actually started my career at IISG, at the International Institute, now many years ago, but really glad to have you here, and the organization has really led at the nexus and intersection of these issues. We also have with us the Principal Secretary for the Kenyan Ministry of Interior and National Administration, Dr. Raymond Amulo. Kenya, from its president all the way down through the ministries, has taken on a leading voice in this discussion internationally, and including for the continent of Africa, but for the entire world, is help leading the charge in how we think about the intersection of peace, security, issues like water and food security as well, and the climate crisis. So thank you for being with us, Doctor. And then finally, we have the U.S. Department of Defense Assistant Secretary for the Navy for Energy, Installations, and Environment, Meredith Berger. The Navy has probably, I probably will get in trouble for saying this, but potentially some of the longest commitments to the climate crisis and environmental security of any parts of the Pentagon. I'm sure the other branches will debate me on that, but thank you for being here and for all the work that you do as well. So I will now move over here and start off our panel with the first question to Assistant Secretary Witowski. So we have talked about this extensively, but can we share for the audience why it's so important for you folks, for people from the conflict community, the stabilization community, the security community, to be here at COP? Why does it matter that you're here in these climate spaces, and what does it mean that you're here, particularly this year, for the first time in such force? Not first time for you, but for the community.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for moderating this panel. And Sherry, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction and for your leadership over the years on this important set of issues that bring us to where we are today. So for the audience, I think it's worth noting that more than 3.6 billion people live in areas highly susceptible to climate change. We also know from research that more than 1 billion people live in areas experiencing fragility or conflict. Climate change can pose challenges to peace and security, as we've said, and the compounding effects of climate change are worsening these situations. And that's really why we need to be here, because climate adaptation, which we're so focused on here, can increase resiliency and the capacity to cope with climate change. Increased resiliency does contribute to peace building. These two pieces are integrally related. And we're really glad to see that COP this year has this theme day of relief, recovery, and peace, which highlights this important nexus between climate change, peace, and security. And it's at this nexus that the peace-building community and the climate community can contribute to one another. Now, there are a couple of initiatives that we have underway that we need to mention. I lead, as has already been mentioned, an initiative for the Biden administration which focuses on long-term planning to address the roots of conflict and violence under the U.S. strategy to promote conflict, to prevent conflict and to promote stability. That strategy and the set of plans that we have underneath that strategy are necessarily comprehensive. They are long-term. They are designed with partnerships deeply in mind. And one of the ways that those plans intersect with the work that we're doing here today is to incorporate questions and approaches related to climate change. As we've stated, there is this really important intersection. Of course, the Biden administration has been deeply committed to climate change, to addressing the climate crisis under the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, or PREPARE. So these two initiatives bring together the climate community and the conflict prevention and stabilization community, and we're really looking forward to integrating that work even more closely as we go forward, not only within our own government, but with our partners, and now with the declaration that we're going to see today, the commitments globally as well.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary. And that's exactly right. I mean, I think what is so often difficult in any of these Nexus topics, but particularly this one, is we are working in our separate silos, and those working on one initiative might not know about another initiative just down the hall that has such important intersections. So, Anne, I want to ask you a little bit about that, because you do work on the adaptation side of this with ISD as the Secretariat for the National Adaptation Plan Secretariat. So what do you see as some practical entry points into the adaptation planning efforts for people in the peacebuilding and conflict communities to make sure that the work they are doing is also integrated into the overall climate adaptation work in a country?
Great. Thanks for the question, and thanks for the invitation to be a part of this panel. I'm really excited to be here. And Sherry, it's great to always be involved in an event with you. So the perspective I'm bringing to today's conversation is from the National Adaptation Planning process and the different actors that are involved in that process in countries. So for those that might not be that familiar with National Adaptation Planning or NAP processes, this is a whole of government effort to basically systematically review climate-related vulnerabilities and impacts, and then identify and then ultimately plan to address how these vulnerabilities are going to be reduced, resilience is going to be built. Basically, a medium to long-term plan for articulating and addressing a country's adaptation priorities. And so what we're already seeing conflict issues being mentioned in these processes, in these plans. And I think that's worth noting because that gives us a really easy hook already. And so when you think about that, the first national adaptation plan that was submitted to the UNFCCC was back in 2015, and it came from Burkina Faso. They had already flagged conflict issues, right? They'd already talked about pastoralists and conflicts around pastoralists and how climate was going to be a potential driver and how this needed to be reflected in how adaptation priorities were reflected in their plan, but also how adaptation interventions were going to be designed. The other thing to note too is, we've got 140 countries developing countries out of 154 that are right now have NAP processes underway, and we have 50 that have been submitted to the UNFCCC. We did a quick analysis and found that half of them already, over half of them, talk about conflict being a potential result of climate drivers. And then we've got about a quarter of them that talk about how conflict can be a driver of vulnerability to climate and how adaptation can be a force for peace building. So it's already being reflected in these processes. And so that's great news to sort of increase, to bring more attention to this agenda, this Nexus agenda. Now, in terms of practical entry points, there are lots in a NAP process. So a NAP process is, you're doing these vulnerability risk assessments to understand how you're going to be affected by climate impacts, design adaptation strategies, then you implement them, and then, of course, you're monitoring and evaluating and learning from the implementation of these strategies. And there are entry points all along the way. But the one thing that I would really highlight is sort of really in that planning phase, because these vulnerability and risk assessments are so foundational to everything that follows, to how interventions are designed and implemented. And so here already is a real opportunity to sort of deliberately look at conflict issues to really understand, okay, how are conflict risks affecting our vulnerability to climate impacts? Is conflict, for example, pushing people into places that are more exposed to climate impacts? For example, are conflict risks, making different populations less able to cope with the impacts of climate stresses? And if you capture these in the analysis, then you can make sure that you're going to be designing interventions that address this. And then the other one thing that I would point out to is, to help this sort of adaptation planning process keep going and turn, you've got all these enabling factors. And the one that I would really like to highlight, we've highlighted 6. And I should mention that, we're developing guidance right now. We're releasing guidance to help different adaptation teams really understand these different entry points. But one of them that I would really highlight as an enabling factor is what you've already touched on, is sort of institutional arrangements, right? Making sure that the right parts of government are speaking to each other throughout this process. Making sure that the folks that are responsible for conflict prevention and peace building in government recognize that there is a really huge asset in government already that understands how climate impacts are going to affect different populations and sectors and ecosystems. So getting them to work together, and we're seeing examples of this already happening in many countries, and we can talk about that later. But those are some of the practical entry points.
That's fantastic. It sounds like there are many, so it sounds like we all have a lot of places to enter. I'm glad you spoke about the risk assessment part of this, because I think that's a really important aspect, even before we get to what we invest in for resilience, how are we sort of seeing the security dynamics and the adaptation dynamics, the climate science and impact dynamics sort of coming together in a similar space. So we'll talk about that more in the coming minutes. But I wanted to bring the next question to Dr. Omolo. Your government, as I said, has made such strides in your climate policy and defining the direction for climate action for yourselves and as a leader globally. So what is your ministry doing to support these efforts and to make sure that, as we were just talking about, aspects like instability or growing conflict or food or water insecurity in your neighborhood as part of these plans and part of your climate plans?
Thank you, and my fellow panelists and distinguished delegates. First is to appreciate that as a ministry within the structure of the Kenyan government, we are at the heart of the delivery of government programs. Now, in the Ministry of Interior and National Administration, part of our priority is to address issues of national security. Now, climate change becomes one of those critical actors in terms of the challenge with the insecurity in the country. There are certain parts of the country that for the longest have had serious conflicts between communities, and this is largely driven on account or driven by competition for resources. Now, as the Ministry of Interior, as part of our coordination role and looking at the climate action that President Ruto is passionate about, where we are looking at achieving a target of increasing our tree cover from 12 to 30%. We realized that there is an element that lacks in terms of coordination, the element around information, and ability to measure and assess progress as we embark on this ambitious program. What then we've done as a ministry is to come up with what we are calling the National Climate Change Readiness Program, which goes at the heart of looking at the various actors, both within government and outside government, coordinated by the government infrastructure which exists within the ministry. And that infrastructure goes all the way down to the most basic level, the village level. And what we are looking at achieving with this program, number one, is we must equip these government officers with the right tools in terms of understanding and appreciating first what climate change is, but also what it means to not just plant trees, but grow trees. Now, this program also looks at the issues around how we are able to better communicate. So whenever we are making an impact, how well do we let the communities and the country know that something is happening and something is changing? Case in point, a few weeks ago on the November 13th, we had the National Tree Growing Day, which was a public holiday. And through this infrastructure, we were able to mobilize the communities. One, the people were able to bring the tree seedlings for planting. Their school-going children were able to be involved in terms of going out and planting trees. And on this particular day, working with in excess of 14,000 government administration officers, were able to plant a record 34 million trees. Of course, that is huge, but it's still not where we would want to go. And what then we are looking at is bringing all the players, bringing all the actors, so that as we go towards this exercise of growing trees, we are able to change behavior, we are able to collate and collaborate and bring resources. Now, within the government infrastructure, you find that there are several players. Primarily, there's a Ministry of Environment, Forestry, and Climate Change, which is the principal ministry that is responsible for this. As a Ministry of Interior, we are coming in to support them to achieve this because of that infrastructure that exists within the ministry. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm definitely going to come back on some of those efforts and have you speak to them more. We were speaking in the green room about how we wish we had our own massive community-wide tree planting day as well. So hopefully we can learn something from you in that. A.S. Berger, we wanted to sort of speak about your role here as the Department of Defense. Already you are sort of showing that you are a partner in this effort of the climate crisis, but also, your entire department has said this is a top national security priority for the Department of Defense. It is a top area of our foreign policy and security priorities. So how do you think about this from the Department of Defense? How are you working with your allies and partners to build climate resilience in those places, and how does that strengthen international security overall?
Thanks, Kate. And I agree with you that the Department of the Navy is leading and doing outstanding things. But I have to say that it is just an indicator of what my colleagues are doing in Army and in Air Force. And so when we say a whole of government, it's a whole of DoD too. And so Sherry talked about first coining the phrase threat multiplier. It hasn't gotten better. And so we are staying focused in line with the fact that we are decades past that initial assessment, and it continues to impact us, and it continues to be existential, not only to partners and allies, but also to the way that the Department of Defense as a whole works, and specifically the Department of the Navy. And so as we look at what we are facing and what it means to engage, we look at it as a whole of government for the United States, and it is a whole of globe for the existential threat that we are facing. That's also our mission set, is whole of globe. And so as we look at that, what I say is that climate readiness is mission readiness. And so when we talk about readiness, this is important. I've actually heard it reflected in each of my co-panelists' comments here. So being ready is having what you need to do what you need in order to do what you need to be able to do when the nation calls on you, in the case of the military, but it translates to communities as well. You were talking about ensuring that every minister down to the most local leadership has those tools and has those sets. And that's what it means to be ready. And so as we look across how we impact that space, it is about partnership. It is about allies, because at the front end, when you look at the military, sometimes it's a sailor or a Marine, and that is the only face that anyone encounters as a representative of the entire United States. And people will see us doing our building on the front end. We contribute to infrastructure, to water security, to ensuring that as we think about what resilient coastlines look like, we are inclusive of what it means for us to operate from those coastlines as the naval fighting force, but also as part of the communities that are at the coastline that are facing the same coastal erosion, the same threat of increasingly powerful storms, too much or too little water, extreme temperatures in both directions, It affects the way people work. It affects the way that things work, and we are losing critical resources that we are all dependent on. And so that's the mindset that the Department of Defense, the Department of Navy takes as we encounter and think about what it means to contribute. We have a plan, Climate Action 2030, emphasis on the action, making sure that we are both building up our resilience, but also reducing the threat. We are big contributors to those threats and mindful of what that means. And so integrating sustainability into every decision that we are making so that it is data informed, our requirements anticipate not only the needs, but the environment that we would like to operate in, because at the end of the day, this is our operational environment that is changing. So we need to change the calculus that we are applying in terms of how we are thinking about it. But the Navy brings to bear weather analytics, health support. We have an etymology center of excellence where we are able to establish data and contribute that so that we are providing the data, the perspective, and the resources not only to ourselves but to the people that we are partnering with, that we are supporting with, because at the end of the day, we are also the world's first responders. And so when we see the most impactful effects of climate change, whether it is migration, whether it is responding to a disaster situation, it is your Navy and Marine Corps who are going to step up and be able to respond. But as we see these increasing impacts of disasters and an increasing call to respond, those same things are impacting our ability to be the first responders. And so as we walk this fine line of wanting to be able to contribute, but being pummeled by the threat as well of what is causing the need to respond, it is even more critical that we create an environment that we have the ability to respond in. And so it is impactful to our mission, it is impactful to our partners, and we are making sure that we are approaching this with the seriousness and whole of Department of Defense that it requires.
Thank you. So interesting to think about how you have done that and how you must both increase your sustainability, increase your investments in resilience, but also do so at a time that those threats are increasing to, the very infrastructure and operations you're trying to make more resilient. So let's drill into this concept of whole of government and whole of society. We've all spoken about it in some ways, but I think particularly for those folks who are not in government, they might not realize how difficult this is to actually integrate something across an entire government, let alone something that people have different perspectives on or interests in or definitions of. And climate and peace is certainly one of those areas that can invite many different sectors and people in, but also can, amount to crossed wires or different strategies or sort of different people swimming in different lanes. So can you speak a little bit about sort of how you have actually seen that whole of government approach? And it's open to anyone who would like to answer how you've seen that whole of government approach work, and also how there might be barriers, and even in the national adaptation planning process or the internal planning process, why that intersection of different people with different expertise is so important to this effort. Yeah.
Maybe I would go first on that. So one interesting thing about the whole of government approach is that, one, it's not a new concept because it's something that has been applied in several other spheres. In the Kenyan case, even in the fight against terrorism, for a long time there was a lot of different government agencies working in silos. Now, with the real threat and the desire to completely deal with the threat, it became apparent that we needed to bring all the players on board, and we are definitely reaping the dividends of that. And we think that even with this climate action, we need to bring all the players on board, whether it's in terms of the technology that is there to be able to monitor and assess, the issues around financing, where the resources are, how do you direct them, so that then we are much more efficient. So we use whoever is available in particular spaces to make the best out of them. So like in the case of my ministry, we have the infrastructure in terms of personnel all the way to the ground. That becomes very critical in coordination. You go to the Ministry of Environment, working with the forestry and wildlife, you are able to get the seedlings in place. You bring the defense, where you are doing seed balling in particular spaces where you cannot do the physical planting of trees, particularly when you're looking at the arid parts of the country. So the military and the defense are able to play their role. You go to the Ministry of Education. Schools have a lot of land that we can be able to utilize to be able to build and grow the trees. Then you have the students and the pupils. So when you bring and map out all the players together, you're able to have much more maximum impact. Thank you.
I'd like to pick up on a couple of those themes that have already been mentioned in terms of whole of government. Whole of government is about bringing together all the tools and the resources that are available to bear on a particular problem set. And we have talked about preventing conflict and promoting stability and looking at it over the longer term. That involves understanding it involves gathering data, it involves the risk assessment, understanding opportunities and vulnerabilities. It involves planning, it involves understanding what the resources are against the plan, it involves monitoring, evaluation, learning. It's a comprehensive. And so what we're talking about here is not only bringing the players together, but also bringing the frameworks together. And that is a really important piece, because what we want at the end of the day is to be working together toward a common set of objectives. Now, in the case of the initiative that we have underway, under the strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability, we're not only doing this in Washington, but we are doing this in a field-driven approach with considerable leadership from our ambassadors, who also represent for the U.S. government a whole of government, or an interagency at each of our embassies. Now, with respect to climate and integrating climate to the work that we do, we have a history of frameworks in the climate space. Now we have frameworks that we are developing for these long-term planning processes, these long-term investments in peace and stability under the U.S. strategy. It's vitally important that we bring them together. And Kate, as you have identified already, it's easy to talk about, but it's not as easy as it looks. It's vitally important. And one big advantage that we have, I think, is goodwill on the part of our U.S. government counterparts. Now, let me just make one other point here. It's not only about whole of government, it's about whole of society. It's about engaging stakeholders. It's about working with our partner governments at the national level, at the regional level, at the local level. It's about working with civil society, academia, our diaspora communities, and the private sector. We really need to bring all those voices to bear in an inclusive way in the planning effort, and then continue to include those voices as we develop our plans, as we iterate our plans, and as we implement our plans. We think that is the way we will create most sustainable solutions.
Just very quickly, I wanted to add into that local level government is critically important, and small business is really important. To pick up on your last point, everything from tribal nations to these innovative, small shop that have big ideas, and local governments that are most impacted by some of the things we see. As the person who's overseeing installations for the Department of the Navy, that's where we see some of the greatest ideas. And while it is not cookie cutter, there are a bunch of permutations of solutions that add up to net zero and all sorts of other things that we're trying to achieve. And so paying attention to that local level is critically important in a number of ways as well.
Quickly, two points that I would like to really emphasize here when we're talking about whole of government, and the two C's of coordination and communications. And I feel like it sounds basic, but it can make or break, how we act on the nexus issues. And with coordination, I feel like these nexus issues can be everybody's business, but nobody's priority. And so having somebody really dedicated who has an eye on these issues, these nexus issues, that knows which parts of government that need to be engaged to sort of drive an agenda forward is critical. So, Kate, this sounds like your job description, and having more of you, people like you, I think would be really helpful for helping us take the next step. And then communication. Here I'm talking some about the basics of language. I mean, bringing people together to have an exchange is, getting them physically in the room is one victory. But then having an actual dialogue, getting people to understand where the shared sort of pain points and opportunities are in these nexus issues requires a lot of brokering, requires a lot of breaking down, removing jargon. And it sounds so basic, but it can make such a massive difference. And then linked to that is looking for opportunities where you can really highlight and celebrate the intersections of these agendas. And so, I'm reminded of one experience in the Central African Republic where their peacebuilding plan was coming to an end. I think they extended their 2017 peace plan, which was supposed to come to an end in 2021, to 2023. And then at the same time, they had just released their national adaptation plan last year. And so that part of government recognized that the peacebuilding plan was going to be updated. There were going to be deliberations around that. And they wanted to make sure, and they knew that there was already a conversation about how climate change needed to be reflected in the peacebuilding plan. And so they took the opportunity of having released and done their national adaptation plan to host a high-level dialogue. And so to get those parts of government together to say, hey, we've articulated our priorities, we've identified vulnerabilities and impacts, we've talked about solutions to reduce them, we've talked about how to bring these agendas together. So bring this into the updated peacebuilding plan. And so finding those moments as well for the communication to be a bit more higher profile, I think is really critical, again, to sort of moving things forward. So coordination and communication.
I think that communication, as you spoke about, is so important because particularly if you're trying to bring someone into this space that doesn't otherwise work in it, the first question will be, well, what do you want me to do? How do you define this term? Sort of what are your priorities? What's the strategy I'm supposed to follow? And I think we're certainly seeing that in the U.S. government as more and more of the group, sort of the whole of government sort of joins the effort. They need to know sort of where are we moving to jointly. That's why sort of within the U.S. system right now, we are working to develop a strategy on climate and security and peace. It's not quite ready for prime time yet, and certainly we'll be taking some of these lessons back into that process. But it's essentially to do just that, to be working from the same definitions and priorities, and for everyone to see themselves in that effort and communicating jointly on that effort. So another piece of this that I think is really important, though, is if we zoom in on the local level, which is what you've encouraged us to do, all of this work still needs to be very specific to the context in which we are working, right? Some of the worst things that we could do as the climate community is parachute in and say, this is where you're vulnerable, and these are the investments you should make in your own resilience, without understanding that local culture, how to be sensitive to it, particularly if it is an area of conflict or of existing vulnerability. So I'm wondering if any of you can speak to sort of what measures can be taken to engage the communities where they are, particularly if they are marginalized or vulnerable, particularly if they're in conflict-prone areas, and how can we make sure that they are ultimately leading the process about their own resilience, and they are deeply engaged in the decision-making processes on all of what we were just speaking about. Yeah.
I just wanted to say quickly, you reminded me of a phrase we say at the Navy a lot, which is communicate in times of calm so you can coordinate in times of crisis. So I think that applies here. But in terms of the local input question and point that you raised, nobody knows home better than the person who lives there. And so it is incredibly important to make sure that you get the benefit of that. In my job, I get to work a lot with our tribal nations, and there is incredible knowledge from the people who have known the land for time immemorial, who can think about how water works, how nature works. Very naturally, nature heals itself and understands the ecosystem and the balance, and that is something that people who have lived on land, whether tribal nations, whether, generations of people know. And so taking the time to get to know people, get to know practice, and make sure that you're spending time, because very often the military is a member of a community, and we share a lot of the values that are in that community, but it is important to do that value sharing in order to return the value. And so that's how we approach a lot of what we do. And I think a good example in the United States specifically, and I'm just not as familiar elsewhere, is tribal treaty rights is a way that we are inclusive of making sure that we get that perspective, but also just going to the source and spending the time because it is meaningful to be in a community, and it's home at the end of the day. We want it to stay that way.
I just wanted to add to that one way to ensure that we are doing exactly as you've described, particularly when we're working with partners overseas who are themselves in leadership roles with whom we are seeking to work together. We need to take an intentional approach. We need to start by saying our efforts are going to be locally led. And that goes to your observation about communication. If we start by understanding that what we are doing must be locally led, from the planning process to the design process to the implementation piece, then I think we can move ahead together in a way that makes sense across the climate community and across the peacebuilding community. And that is really very much where we see opportunities for success. I very much agree with what you've had to say.
Maybe, again, giving the Kenyan context, first is there is what has now been embedded in our constitution as public participation. So whenever there are legislations, whenever there are government policies, the public have to be involved. Now, what we have done across the country is that whether it's legislation or just development programs, there is an elaborate engagement and conversation that happens with the communities, particularly in the conflict zones, where a lot of that conflict is as a result of resource constraints. We have recently just completed the review of our peace-building architecture, and you're able to engage the leadership in the communities, both women and the very senior citizens and the youth, in terms of what is very crucial to their livelihoods. So you'd have in instances where people prioritize issues around provision of water, issues on education, so that then you are able to draw communities to appreciate the role that some of these interventions play in resolving the conflict. We are actually adopting the same with regards to our tree growing campaign, because this has the net effect of addressing the long-drawn conflicts that have existed between the communities. So there's a lot more of consultation and engagement, particularly with the marginalized communities. And of course, with our structure of governance, we have the national government and then the county governments. With the coming into place of the county governments, it's made people feel and appreciate government as being very close to them, and them having a say and being represented in decisions at every level. Thank you.
Thank you. I've seen that up close. I was in Kenya just last year and saw some of the communities both struck by some of the most increasingly dire aspects of the climate impacts of the climate crisis, but also saw exactly what you're talking about, which is the communities sort of taking on that effort and leading it themselves, from the environmental defenders who are defending the incredible park infrastructure across Kenya, to those who are sort of charting out what the future vulnerabilities might look like in their own regions. So let's zoom in on that. We spoke about it earlier, but on this early warning capacity, on the risk assessment part, on sort of how we try to predict the future, even if that future is going to be probably unpredictable, particularly based on past data of what we've seen. So Anne, you spoke about this a little bit, but how is that data aspect, the early warning aspect, and getting that information out to people? How is that? Sorry, Anne Hamill. Yeah. Two hands. How is that sort of so critical to the work that you've been speaking about, and why is that the most important first phase of this national adaptation planning process?
Well, I mean, ultimately with adaptation, you want to know what you're adapting to. And so, of course, you start with where you are right now and how you're coping with what's happening right now. But the whole point of adaptation is you're trying to think about in the medium and long term, what are the conditions and some of the stressors that we need to take into account, and how do we basically future-proof our development, priorities and aspirations. One of the most important sort of gaps that I think fragile and conflict-affected settings deal with is data. And I had a colleague of mine that pointed out to me this morning. This is one of the statistics that I think is really captures the situation. You compare Afghanistan with one of the most sort of stable and developed countries, Finland. You've got Afghanistan that's twice the size of Finland, has over 7 times the population of Finland, but it has 4 land surface weather stations, climate stations. Finland has 922. And so you can already see right there the massive gap in data, and so trying to then design projects and programs and policies that are going to tell you what you're adapting to is just so much more. They're so much more of a challenge for countries like Afghanistan. And so I think, and we'll probably hear about it, I think, there are open data services out there that allow countries and contexts like that be able to fill these gaps, which is going to be critical. But I think, investing in the data capacities and investing in the climate services in these settings is a massive priority, and I think we're seeing the world respond to that already. But it's not to say that you can't do anything without perfect data. Of course not. But it's going to be it's a high priority for sure.
Other Anne?
I think you said it very well. It is a high priority, and we do understand that there are significant data gaps, and we need to invest in that data so that we can create for ourselves more evidence-driven decisions. That's where we really want to go. And we also want to go to a place where we can be more effective at prevention. Because in our case, prevention saves lives, and it saves a costly response. So we are working to invest in data increasingly, and as we're talking about working across communities and breaking down silos, we're also looking for data that is already out there and seeking to understand how we can apply it. That's within our own government. Now, beyond that, multilaterally, we have also taken a new step to invest as a founding member in a UN multi-donor pooled fund for data. It's called the Complex Risk Analytics Fund, and it was established last year, and it has a number of donors, and it provides us all greater access to the kind of data that we want. And ultimately, what we want is for that data to be widely accessible so that it can be utilized widely as well. Now, one of the things that we've done through the fund, we're very pleased about, is to invest with other donors in 6 new climate fragility data sets at the level of $4 million, which I think is one of the largest investments in this kind of data that we've seen to date. So to the point that's already been made, we understand the challenge and we're moving to address it.
I just think I have a vignette that pulls together a lot of what we've been talking about. It is whole of government. It is data responsive, early warning, and kind of how we can work together. And we talk a lot about the funding that goes into things, and sometimes the investment of the resource of time conversation is one that yields some pretty high returns. And so something that we've heard from our Caribbean partners through our ambassadors and through other partnerships is that there is a lack of technology and data that allows that region to best understand some of the impacts coming their way when it comes to storms, and also retroactive data that would inform resilient infrastructure, how to do the logistics for disaster preparedness and response. And so through the Department of Navy, started having these conversations, recognized the gap that existed, and we realized that NOAA has a lot of this information and data, and so picked up the phone and said, NOAA, we're interested in getting more of this storm data so that we can help inform some of our partners in the Caribbean region who are missing this. And we'd also like to educate some of their meteorological experts so that we can incorporate this and go forward, because we understand what it's like to be a coastal community and see what this impact is. And so we saw a gap and see a way to close it. We'll do a tabletop exercise with the region before the next Atlantic hurricane season, so that way we can understand more specifically where some of these answers are helping, where we have some more gaps to close, but taking that action and the climate action to make sure that we're using data to inform the way that we can be collectively more resilient. And so just wanted to bring it together. I saw something that tied it all.
That's great. That's what we need. More of things that tie together. So we're running very short on time. I want to let you all give concluding thoughts based on the conversation here. There are so many topics that we could have spoken about that we haven't. Other nexus topics that also find their way into this topic. Things like gender and women, peace, and security. Two big areas of the climate crisis and women, peace, and security that we need to be thinking about together. We will, as the U.S., have another big and exciting event on that topic tomorrow. So you heard it here first with a special guest, former Secretary of State, joining us on stage for that. But there's also issues like water security and mobility and migration, things that are sort of impacting all of what we've spoken about, and potentially are different entry points, as you said, and to the overall process of stability and peace are these many different strands of work. So I wanted to sort of do a lightning round down the line of any concluding thoughts with the prompt, sort of as we leave this COP that has sort of finally made peace a center issue, how can we take and implement not just the commitments we've made collectively in the declaration, but also what we've spoken about here? So what is the piece that you think is the most important to get to work on together as we break through these silos? So putting you on the spot here, but maybe Dr. Rulo, you want to give us a start?
There are definitely quite a lot of things that I would take out of this conversation. But I think one thing that stands out is the need to build capacity in terms of us making a difference. And the other for me is as we build the capacity, then we need to really work on the partnerships so that we are able to benefit from what has worked in across. And we then don't have to reinvent the wheel in this process. And of course, the whole of government, whole of society approach to addressing the concerns on climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne, how about you?
Sure. I mean, I think the takeaway here is just reaching out regularly, deliberately, and listening, and sort of to be completely self-promotional. I just wanted to share that, the National Adaptation Plan Global Network is going to be releasing guidance targeted to national adaptation planning teams in government to really understand what those entry points are for integrating peace and conflict sensitivity into the adaptation planning process. So watch for the guidance, and hopefully that'll be a useful tool to bring these communities together.
That's great. We will eagerly await that in the community. Meredith, how about you?
Sure. Climate readiness is mission readiness, and so we're going to take this threat multiplier and turn it into an opportunity multiplier by making sure that we are communicating in times of calm so we can coordinate in times of crisis to ensure our sustainable future.
Anne, final word here. Over to you.
Oh, well said. I think as we look to the medium and the long term, we build our partnerships, we take our whole of government and our whole of society approaches. We also need to look to the near term to understand what it is that we can accomplish, to show some facts on the ground, to take away from this COP some key priorities that we're going to be pursuing immediately. And Kate, I know I look forward to working with some of those with Meredith, and I hope with my new colleagues as well. Thank you.
Yeah, lots of work to do. So sorry to end right on the mark here. I know many of you probably had questions. Potentially we can stick around a little bit and personally answer some questions if you had them. But thanks to all of you for engaging in this topic, for coming, and cheers to a first ever Leaf Recovery Peace Day at a COP. Thank you all. Thanks.